So what I want to do now is take all of those geologic principles that we've been talking about and let's put it all together. Because this is what you're going to be doing for the homework exercise in this chapter. You're going to notice that there's no geo tour for this chapter, but instead there's a worksheet that you're going to be doing on Blackboard. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using this concept of relative time. And all relative time is putting things in order. So we're going to put things in a sequential order. It would just be like if you were to read a paragraph and then try to put the order of events in that paragraph you read in order. It's the same exact thing. So let's take a look here. Let's look at this figure. This is one from your book. And you're going to notice on your worksheet for this chapter, it's going to be something similar, where you have several different cross sections and you're going to have to put all of these events in order. So let's take a look here. The first thing you're going to have to do is label the rock units. So what I mean by label is put number 1 at the oldest, which is, remember, always at the bottom, and then you label up. Okay. So here you see we've got 5, 6 rock units, 7 rock units. We have a sill. Okay, we have a dike. We have a fault. We have a pluton. So these are all things that you're going to kind of have to label as you go through. Some of these aren't going to be nearly that complicated. So let's start off with the beginning of our story. So if I want to figure out what the first step is in my story, where am I going to have to look? Hopefully you said the bottom, right? Remember, everything that's at the bottom is the oldest. So what I want to do now is, obviously, the first thing I'm going to have to do in my story is deposit rocks. So let's take a look. Here we see we have units 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I have a sill, and then I have layers 5, 6, and 7. Now, if you remember back to how sills form, sills interject themselves in between layers. So I know I'm not missing any time between layers 4 and 5. The sill had to have come in after that was deposited. We also know this because if you look, you see parts of 5 and parts of 4, right? Principle of inclusion's in there. So that tells you the sill comes afterwards. So I can go ahead and say I'm going to deposit units 1 through 7. Now, the next thing I want to look at, okay, if you notice we have several things going on. Like I said, we have a sill, we have a dike, we have a pluton, and a fault. This is where I can start to use cross-cutting relationships. If I look in the pluton, we see that we have bits of 5 included in there. So I know the pluton had to have happened after all the stuff was deposited. The fault cuts across the pluton. Do you see how the pluton is also disjointed just like the rock layers? It's not matched up. So that tells me the fault happened after that pluton. The dike cuts across all of this, right? So I know that happened much later. But now let's look at the sill. The sill interjects itself between units 4 and 5. Now if you notice, remember, how are my rocks initially deposited? Hopefully you said flat lying. So rocks 1 through 7 were initially flat. Then they were folded. So we have to account for this folding event as a step here. But before we do that, let's take a look. Is my sill folded like the rock layers, or does it cut across the rock layers? Hopefully you said the sill is folded like the rock layers. So that tells me my sill had to have happened next, and then we get the folding of 1 through 7 and the sill. Alright, now all we have to do is untangle this mess here between the dike, the pluton, and the fault. So if you remember going back, right, to what we discovered, we saw that the dike happens after the fault and the pluton, and the fault is cutting across the pluton, so I know my next thing here is going to be the intrusion of the pluton. Now, if you notice, there is this hazy bit kind of sitting around the pluton. If you remember, that is a baked contact. If you remember back from the igneous chapter, that's what we call the aureole. Alright, so then our next thing here is our fault. And then we have our dike. See how easy that was? We were able to untangle this complicated geologic history by basically using the principle of cross-cutting relationships. Now, what you're going to be doing for your homework isn't nearly this hard. You're not going to have to tell me this whole story word for word. What you're going to be doing is literally putting things in order, putting events in order. So you'll say number 1 happened, then number 2, then number 3, then number 4. So it's going to be actually much easier than what we just did here together. But I wanted you to see the totality of how all of this comes together.